This week on the Sports Initiative podcast, I sit down with professional golf coach Stuart Morgan. He discusses his work with PGA Tour players and how he assists them over the entire season, the challenges around block practice, and how to more effectively coach players suitable to how they would play during a round, as well as players utilising their strengths and how to hold their nerves during high-pressured moments. As always, if you enjoy this podcast, please make sure you share it with friends and family. I hope you enjoy. Right, Stuart, we are good to go. As I said to you before I started, I've got a different mural behind me today. I've got all the Southampton players looking over my shoulder with Matt Letizia and Alan Shearer. So a bit of a different background, but hopefully the same good conversation that I'd normally have if I was at home.
I was looking at the Welsh player Gareth Bale there, so and me being a Liverpool fan, seeing Lallana there as well, which is always good.
Yeah, I mean, everyone who listens knows I'm a Spurs fan, so Bale's a good one. Walcott, not so much, but we won't be so picky. But yeah, thank you so much for doing this. I think that you're my first specialized golf guest, which is brilliant because one, I've just
Excellent.
got into golf, and I'm spending a bit of time on the course, which is amazing. I'm really enjoying it. But two, I think that probably the industry of golf and golf coaching is a really, really interesting one to dissect and of how it can go across to other sports as well. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Pleasure.
So for people that maybe don't know you, other than what I've just said there, which is you work in golf, could you just give us a bit of a whistle-stop tour of who you are, what you do?
My name's Stuart Morgan. I've worked in professional golf for the since I was 25. I'm 47 now. Um, God knows how I got into it because I worked for a guy called David Ledbetter, and and my kind of journey went along, got into all different types of things. So got into the junior world, which I kind of wrote a book on called The Gifted Junior. But then kind of like looped back around to the professional world where I've coached winners on major tours, been to the last two Ryder Cups, coaching golf, and my journey has kind of taken me more into the like motor learning and practice world. I'm still a golf coach and I still feel myself as a golf coach, but I kind of like trying to get that science element and try and look at the history. My doctorate that I'm doing at the University of Limerick, I'm 2 years into that right now. That's also on practice as well, specifically in elite golf. So yeah, a lot that has kind of happened in the last, there's probably about 2008 when I met a certain person that introduced me into this area, 2008, 2009, something like that. And yeah, like so grateful I got involved in it because it's opened up a whole world of different opportunities. And coming from golf, where it's a very traditional sport, where you're trying to introduce some new kind of practice theories that are very old as well, but they just haven't kind of like transitioned into the world of golf just yet.
So I can tell already that we're going to have problems fitting this in the time frame. So this might end up having to be where we revisit further down the line, but we'll give it a go. So I think firstly, as a nice starting point, you obviously mentioned about being drawn into this world from a coaching capacity, but with those two things, so why golf originally? Why the sport of golf? And then secondly, what drew you towards coaching? Why did you begin to ingrain into this world?
So funny enough, I was like a footballer and a golfer at the same time. So I was chatting to somebody the other day. I had Welsh schoolboys trials in Aberystwyth, and the Welsh under-15s golf championship in the same week,
Nice.
1 year. So, and then when you start to get down the road, you're kind of like, well, what am I going to do here? And I kind of loved golf, probably more than I loved football, to be honest, although I do love football too. And then as I kind of went on, I would say everybody has aspirations of playing professional golf. And I gave it a crack for like 1 year when I turned professional. But I realized very, very quickly that this is not where I am. I was much more, my boss at that time was quite a world-renowned kind of coach in the area in South Wales. I did my PGA training, and it just kind of went from there. So there was always books and video cassettes at that time, of different golf coaches and whatnot. And that was what kind of sparked my interest about it, to be honest. And that's really kind of, he supported me, and then I kind of went on to pastures new and went to work for David Ledbetter. So I think primarily it was like, okay, player, didn't really realize I wasn't going to do that. Wasn't good enough even in the region and some of the tournaments that I played. But it was a kind of a good breeding ground as well. So I kind of was an early adopter, I guess, from that respect. I didn't stick around too long thinking I can still be a player, which is good and a bad thing, I guess.
Yeah, no, I feel you on that. I think I gave up playing properly around the same time. So I was very similar to you, going, I'm probably not going to make a decent career
Yeah.
out of playing, but coaching potentially. So yeah, I know exactly how you felt on that front. So if we discuss golf more generically, what I know you mentioned the motor skills bit, which we'll delve into later, but generically, what does golf coaching look like? What would um a normal golf coach do, and how would they go around trying to help individuals not hit the balls into trees like I would do?
Yeah, I think traditionally it's been very much, I would say, since I've been involved in it, in the coaching element, is that driving ranges have become very prominent, right? And they've become very big businesses as well, in a good way. It allows people that if they have 45 minutes, an hour, they don't want to go to the club, but they can go to a driving range and kind of hit some balls and stuff like that. So when you're kind of coaching is, it kind of starts out where you kind of meet on this driving range really now, and you kind of like discuss what that player is doing, what level they're at, what level do they want to get at, what kind of problems are they having with the ball flight, and so on and so forth. Um, but I would say it stops there too much. I think that there's not enough done, on the golf course. Personally, if I was going to be critical about the thing, and that's actually down to a number of reasons. I think it's this access. Sometimes, people go for a golf lesson and the teacher is just on a driving range, which kind of happens a lot. Sometimes golf course is extremely busy, but it's a very rare sport in that sense, is that you kind of practice. We have a specific practice ground for golf, whereas if you look at other sports, you don't really have that. Even in football, you train on the pitch. On the tennis, you train on the court. So that's kind of where it's at, to be honest. I don't think it's going to change,
Why do you say that?
because I think driving ranges are business, and I think that they're always going to be around. So I don't think it's as a coach, it's our job to look and say, well, we need to get rid of this. We need to adapt to it, and we need to start using driving ranges in a more contextual way, rather than just going there, getting 100 balls and just like hitting 100 balls with a 7 or a 6 iron.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting in terms of that context not being there. And as I said, I've been trying to play a little bit more recently, and the factors of having bunkers in certain places or water in certain places, obviously from a psyche point of view, that is a little bit off-putting. But also probably things that you don't get on driving range that has been a real learning curve for me is kind of placement of feet comparative to ball. So where you
Yeah.
are you higher, are you lower, are you the same? Are you going up a ridge, down a ridge, and how that can change? And probably one of the best learning tools I've had is playing with my friend who's a 10 handicap.
Hmm.
because he can kind of almost talk me through and go, well, what are you seeing at this moment in time? And maybe begin to fill in bits of information that I'm missing as a relatively novice golfer.
Yeah, and I think you can't learn that on the driving range unless the driving range has, a kind of like a floor that's on hydraulics, which they do start to do now for different lies and stuff like that. But you're still not going to get the same, grass contact, like those mats at driving ranges. The club will bounce a little bit easier and make poor shots seem a little bit better than they actually are than if you're on wet grass, for example. And you're right. I mean, if you look at the environmental world of like what you talked about, like bunkers, water, trees, and whatnot, these kind of things, they change movement. You can have the best, golf swings you want on a driving range off a flat lie, but those things will influence what you do when you get out on the golf course. So that to me is like, how do we put that, if somebody can only get to the driving range, right? So say they work a lot and whatnot, and then get to the driving range once a week and then play once a week. It's like, well, how can you contextualize that hour that you spend on the driving range? Like, can you imagine there's a tree there? Can you imagine that flag is on the front of a green over water? Like, what are you going to do in these situations? And I think that if you can kind of close that gap a little bit, as much as you can, then you'll start to get much better transfer to that world of playing on the golf course. If you can also get on the golf course and practice, I think there's huge like value in, like you said, playing with better players, but also, taking a coach or whatnot out on the golf course for an hour and just going out there and saying, we're just going to throw the ball in all different lies today or in all different situations. And we're going to start to kind of solve the problem that's in front of us to the best that we can. That to me will start to get that transfer from driving range to golf course a little bit quicker.
I've just come up with a business idea, but we'll catch up on that off air. We could both become millionaires by this time next year. So, yeah, we'll catch up on that one when no one's listening. But I guess one of the things that I find really interesting, which lays a little bit into what we said, and probably a bit of segue across, is we seem to have modern day coaching moved away from the idea of a perfect technique and more of the case of people can self-organize, and as long
Yeah.
as an outcome is relatively close to what we're after, that's okay. Is that the case in golf? So is there still, yeah, is that the case in golf in terms of not going after a perfect technique? Or do they still see in most clubhouse of going, right, oh no, we're going to try and break down your technique and it has to look like this?
I think that world has got better. I think it started out like really good, like with, before video camera kind of came into play. And I'll go on to that in just a second. Um, and I think that there's a mix right now, if I'm going to be honest. There will be some that will try and go to like this one technique, and everybody will fit into that technique rather than the technique fit into the athlete. They have to fit into this model. But there are other things, like Titleist Performance Institute, and there's a gentleman called Terry Rowles and Mike Adams. Mike is an Hall of Fame golf coach, and they came up with sort of like, I'd call them, I guess they're physical constraints, like different arm lengths, different heights, forearm lengths, upper arm lengths, grip. So now it's starting to kind of like match the individual a little bit more. But there is still that kind of like half and half, I would say. I think we're definitely getting better at it. I don't know why that is though. But I also think that there was a big era where, if you look at back at the older stuff, we, especially for golf movement, right, or a golf swing or a golf shot, learning as a whole is beneficial. And then for some reason, at some point, like when we started to be able to slow video down, like pausing it and whatnot, I think like Franz Bosch talks about movement became postures rather than actual whole movement. And I do think that at some point, I don't know when, I'm trying to push this forward to get people to realize that, we will self-organize around multiple different factors. And if we go back to these simple, like first principle ideas that the great golf coaches of way back, John Jacobs for one of them, will just start to kind of go, well, impact on the golf ball. If it's at the center, if the club face is pointing here and the swing direction is going there, then the ball will do this. So if you have a desired shot or off a certain lie, if you can understand those principles, and I think that should be a real kind of big education point for coaches and players. Doesn't matter what level you're at. You can understand those first principle ideas of what makes the ball do this, then I think it's a whole lot easier to kind of to work around that self-organization around those physical constraints that an individual has ultimately.
Yeah, so that's probably leads into my next question, which is if I was to say to you what are maybe some non-negotiables that most efficient swings have. So if you were to say to someone who'd never picked up a club before, if you try and do X, Y, Z, that will increase your chances of having a clean contact. And let's say in this example, we're just trying to hit, a 6-iron straight down the fairway. No, yeah, it's a nice wide fairway, beginner course, anything like that. What are some of the non-negotiable basic things that you would look for in that scenario?
For me, I mean, the first thing I would look at is just what the club face or the club head is doing. Because if the club head, for example, gets, even going back, if it gets really, really open, we will organize ourselves to try and square that club face up. If it gets really, really closed, you can see this with, different types of players, like in the professional game, like Webb Simpson gets the club face like rotated really open, and then he starts to manipulate it coming down. Dustin Johnson on the other extreme, he gets really, really closed, and then, he will self-organize to square the club up, but it's all relative to a shot that they want to hit. So for me, it's getting the individual to go, what's the club face doing? What relative to the shot that you want to hit? And then can you start to learn to adapt your setup and ball position and whatnot around, the environment when they're actually out playing? And if we look at, so I did a course recently for, or we do this course with the thing called the Practice Thinkers, and we did this section for coaches, and it was around this kind of first principle, and we talked about this like funnel of variability, whereas all great players look, top of the backswing and whatnot, look completely different. They have their own identity. You can almost like spot them from miles away. But when they come down and the club is, let's say, parallel to the ground, like what we call delivery position, there's a lot more similarity with these players, again, relative to the shot that they want to hit. So going back, it's quite variable. They look very, very different, but coming down just pre-impact or pre-contact with the golf ball, there's a lot more similarity with great players. So it's then making the decision of, okay, well, we, as human beings, we have these fancy word called intrinsic dynamics, right? So there's stable points within the movement where we will move towards because they feel most stable to us. But that to me is also related to what we're seeing with these elite performers as well. They might think that they're changing something, but actually they're moving to stable states within their golf swing. But when they're also coming down into the golf ball, shifting their weight towards the target, that club is still coming down into that stable like delivery position. So I think club head, club face, and concept to ball flight. That's where I would go with every player.
It's what's interesting what you're saying there. I think is that delivery phase is. I'm not saying you can ignore what goes on prior, but I'd imagine a lot of historical work has been done previously of going, well, no, your wrists have to look like this, or your club face has to be there. Where actually, if we're saying that the most similarity between top players is in this phase, could we almost ignore what goes on up here and focus more in the delivery phase and go, how they get from that to that doesn't really matter. It's like, are they in that position at that moment of time? I think Steve Smith with leaving balls in
Yeah,
cricket, everyone, it's a completely counterintuitive way of doing it. The fact that he almost moves his entire body to then leave a ball, but it's the same effect as someone having a perfect stance to leave the ball. So what does it actually matter?
yeah, and there's also that element of going, if I am going to try and change this, I'm making a real big prediction ultimately, because I'm thinking if I change this, the club face or whatnot at the top of the backswing, I'm then thinking it's going to change what happens to the golf ball. Because if I'm not thinking that and I'm just looking at it from a visual, then I'm just changing the golf swing to that ideal model. So to me, we're ultimately making our best guesses. I think a lot of the time to say, well, if I change this, or I want to change this, then what influence is that going to have at the point of collision with that golf ball? And I think that's a big thing. And I think that's why some people go very much to this ideal model, because it's kind of easy in that respect. Is you have to be here, you have to be here, you have to be here. But some people just can't do it.
And look, listen, this is going to sound really harsh, but as a practitioner, when you're coaching that, it's also easier for you to coach because you're not having to look at the individual's context. So you
Yeah,
mentioned all those variables in terms of joint lengths or
yeah,
limb length or joint flexibility. You're not actually having to consider any of that. You're going, well, no, you're not doing this step. So I'm not
yeah,
saying that's laziness on some people's part. It might be, but it might also be in the skill level you're at that moment in time as you're coaching. And I would have been the same with football, where I would have taught certain principles. Where now I'm thinking that was a mistake. I shouldn't have done it
yeah,
in that way. But yeah, it's almost an easier way to coach because it's like a tick list of things for me to check
yeah,
to get the example that I need.
yeah, 100%. And that's actually the moment where I got extremely disillusioned with the golf uh, teaching. I was out on tour and this player was like, you'd see in them kind of like trying to change a movement. And this was me at that time, like thinking that this is ideal model around how this player should swing the golf club. And the player just couldn't do it. And when they did do it, they played terrible. And it was like, well, so in my head, I'm thinking there has to be more to this. It can't just be like asking them to do that. And that's kind of what sent me on this down this rabbit hole, to be honest.
So then, if we're then looking, let's say we're looking at delivery points and stuff, and you're working with either an athlete or a young player or novice player, and you're working on a particular technique for them to explore. So it might be that they really struggle to draw the ball from right to left, and you're working on that. How would you go around teaching them that or giving the opportunity to explore it without just going real high repetition of 100, 500, 1,000 golf balls on a driving range?
Yeah, so I'm like I said earlier, I don't know if we were recording at that point, but if we look back to like to the 70s, 60s in the motor learning literature, especially with regards to the golf swing or chip in or pitch in, it's a discrete skill, right? So it has a very clear beginning and an end. So, and it happens really fast as well. So even back then, the literature in the motor learning world was like, well, that type of skill will benefit if you keep it whole to start with. So we would call that from a now something like action fidelity in some theories, where we want the action to be very similar to what we're going to experience on the in the world of golf or on the golf course. So that's where I would kind of go to start with. I would definitely try and keep it as whole and the same sort of speed as possible. And then what I would do, if the player understands the concept of the shot that they want or what needs to happen at that point of contact, then I would set up and to say, well, do they have all these sort of like, do they have characteristics within how they move to be able to do that to start with? And then probably set up some kind of like task constraint, like put something out in front of them, put something around the ball that they can learn to keep it whole, but also learn to kind of self-organize around. And the big thing with it is when we look at it, I never like them to stay too long in that world. I would ask them after maybe 5-6 shots to maybe just hit a pitch or hit a tee shot or something different, and then sort of come back in and do it again. So you're always kind of breaking up the session ultimately from a practice perspective.
Perfect. You've come to what my next question was going to be, because obviously when you're on a golf course, assuming you don't top it 5 yards like I do, and you
Yeah,
get to use the same club again, but you're more than likely going to go maybe a driver to a 5-iron, putter. Then the
yeah,
next hole might be, a 7-iron off the tee for a par 3. So there's quite a lot of variability within
yeah.
one, the shots that you're playing, two, what clubs you're using. So how do you get the consistency of them being able to practice this technique or skill that they're trying to develop in an environment that is, I guess, forever changing? It's quite variable, particularly if they're of a good standard.
Yeah.
You're not going to end up where they're getting multiple goes at the same shot because they've knocked it 5 yards.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a brilliant question, something I've thought of extensively, and from a theoretical standpoint, and tried this out from a practical standpoint as well. So when so if I look at like two areas here, so if I look at, let's say, within skill variability, so let's say I've got in golf a certain yardage range, right? Let's say for simplicity reasons, 100 to 150 yards, okay? And I vary my club within that, but I'm still going to a kind of a similar target, or I might try and hit one shot right to left and one shot left to right. But it's fundamentally a similar type of skill. Then what you've got is between skill. So between skill is like what we class as like a serial order. It's a predetermined order, and that's how golf is played for me. It's not really going to change too much, like you said, unless you kind of top it just off in front of you. But hopefully that becomes quite rare. But it's you tee off from a certain point, and then you might hit an iron shot to the green, and you either chip, hit out of the bunker or whatnot. That's how the game is played. That's not gonna change. We're not gonna start off with a putter and work the other direction, unless you're just messing around. So in my mind, I'm always thinking, like, for players that I work with, how do we get more to there? Now that doesn't mean that I'm not going to start them at some point with, okay, well, let's go between your sand iron, your pitching wedge, and your 9-iron, and let's alternate between these clubs more within skill. So it's kind of like, okay, it's in that kind of blocky one area environment. But if I see that they're getting it, or they start to kind of like hit it at the middle, starting to get the shot that they kind of want, I'm going to change that instantly. So I might then go, okay, let's just throw a driver in here and then hit a 9-iron, or let's just go to slightly some longer clubs. So I'm just going to increase the challenge a little bit. But in my mind, I'm always thinking about how do I get them more to match the behaviors that they're going to experience on the golf course. That's my thought process always.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I think the variability bit is interesting because just the nature of what you're going to experience on a course.
Yeah,
Um, and I've been guilty of it where you go and take a couple of clubs down the driving range or whatever, and you just keep hitting that club, and then you go on the course, and you're like, well, I can't hit as well as I did in the driving range.
yeah,
And it's like, well, yeah, it's probably because you didn't have 52 warm-up goes to just only use
yeah.
that length club with only that stance, with only it being flat. So there's quite a lot of principles around it. So having that
I
ability to chop and
you know
change.
what? I almost don't mind that somewhat with a driver, right? Because you've always got ball in hand with a tee shot, right? So you can control tee height a bit more. It's generally pretty flat. But I still like to get the player to hit a tee shot and then hit something else after that as well. Then hit maybe another tee shot. Because I think I think if we look at that the adaptability, right? The adaptation of an athlete going out, or golfer going out and playing the game, to adapt to all different scenarios that might come to us. I can't remember for the life of me what her name is, but um, there was a. I have to find it for you, but there's this lady talks about anti-fragility, right?
Mm.
And how we kind of goes into the differential learning where we're trying different things all the time, which actually creates a more stable athlete because we're able to adapt and we're able to kind of be aware of what's moving at what place and what time and so on and so forth. But that's very illogical to us, I believe. I think we think that if we just go there and we just rip out 200 balls with one club, that feels more, or that logically, that makes us feel like we're more stable with what
Yeah.
we're doing.
Yeah.
But we're not, but that's not why we do it. We're not there to just be stable there. We want to be stable when we go and play, but ultimately to be stable, we need to be adaptable because there's different lies, different grasses, all these different things. And that's always where like I said, my thought process is going to.
And then how do you manage it with the time between strokes?
Yeah,
Because
on the
again,
driving range, that's hard, isn't it? It's
yeah,
like,
you get rapid fire of just going right. I've shanked that one right. Get another one down. I'm just going to whack it. Whereas I think one of the other real challenges with golf is, you might hit a really good shot and you might be playing in a four ball, for example. So you hit a really good shot. And now I'm actually waiting maybe 5 minutes by the
yeah,
time we've walked up to the ball. I'm the furthest, so I've got to let the other three play. So you're in a position where I've, yeah, obviously I'm doing a lot of calculations in my head in terms of what club to use or that type of stuff. But actually, I'm now almost out of the zone after hitting that zone and need to drop back into it. So how do you manage that time piece? Because I think in golf, that's another fascinating thing from a psychological point of view.
I mean, it's a big one. I think a lot of it comes down to, choice of the golfer that's going to the driving range as well. So there are little things you can kind of do is don't have your clubs in the bay with you, or don't have the golf balls in the bay. Just have them kind of like back against the wall so you always have to kind of walk to get another ball. It's not going to be the same, but at least there's a little bit of that space, that separation. Um, there's a little exercise that I do, and I mean, you can change it based on the skill level of the player as well, depending on what you're trying to do. But it's a thing called stand or deliver. So let's say you have a relatively new golfer, right? And there's some sort of target or a kind of a green or something out on the driving range, and you get a yardage on it. And let's say it's a 9 iron or an 8 iron. So you stand there and you go, okay, we have 5 minutes on the clock. If you hit this ball onto that green, we're going to take 1 minute away. If you don't, you're going to stand for 5 minutes until you get another trial. So what I'm doing now is we're eliciting a little bit of an emotional response where that one ball feels like, okay, this means something now. And you're getting the best of both worlds there. And if somebody goes, okay, just rips it, and all of a sudden the 5 minutes are gone in like 5 or 6 shots, brilliant. You can kind of like say, right, you're absolutely on it today. Let's do something else. But if somebody's kind of like battling and you're adding in that kind of context, that's ultimately what it's like on the golf course. You get one go, but you're also getting really good feedback on it as well.
And it might help you with those first tee nerves as well when you're teeing off, because you know that is your one go at it.
Yeah. You could do stuff like that with like penalty shootouts as well in football. That similar type of skill. Somebody's practicing the penalties. Okay, you know, one go. Let's kind of elicit this. You score. You take a minute off. You miss or the keeper saves. You have to stand for 5 minutes before you get another trial here. But you don't get to kind of go on your phone or do whatever. You stand there and kind of watch what everybody else is doing.
Yeah, it's the I know in American football they do that with a little bit of jeopardy for punt returners. So the ones that are getting long punts and that they want them to catch it, obviously for good habits. I've seen footage of coaches basically saying to them, if you catch this ball, we get the rest of the day off.
Yeah.
And then they get their punter to send it as high as they can, and then
Yeah.
it's coming down, and you've got obviously not on a normal squad they're 53, but they have practice squad players. You've probably got 100 plus people all watching you try and catch this
Yeah.
ball, knowing if you do, everyone gets to go home and or go to the beach or wherever they want to go for the rest of the day. So I think adding those pressure elements is quite an interesting
And
facet to it.
I think that the nice thing about that is that I think sometimes in golf, and I guess it's different. If somebody, let's say, if somebody has, they've paid for like a pile of golf balls, right, at the driving range, they're going to want to hit all those golf balls before they go home, right? But if they're at a golf club where the golf balls, they're just part of the membership and whatnot, you can do stuff like that, especially with good players, and say, right, if we complete this task today, right now, you're out of here. You're done. If you don't, we're going to go again. We're going to keep doing it until you have another go. And having that, sometimes I think people overstay their welcome in certain environments. If you had a great day today and you've practiced fantastic, just go and do something else. Just get out of there.
Yeah. No, it sounds simple, but it is. I think it makes complete sense because some days you just go, I'm striking it really clean. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
maybe go into
Yeah.
the weight room or do something else then. Like
Yeah,
if
do
you
something else.
you're striking it
Exactly.
clean,
Go and have a different recovery, or go and do something you haven't done before. Go on a bike ride somewhere, or whatever it might be.
yeah. And obviously we'll link probably onto your author work now and work in that space. But when we're talking about, I guess, the differences between working with children at those younger age groups and what you're trying to explore with them, and then the performance athletes right at the very top, you obviously mentioned kind of being around Ryder Cups and that, which is the most high profile moment of an individual's career. What are some of the key differences between the two? And is there anything that, I guess, particularly in the performance space, that surprised you having gone in there from a coach perspective when you're working with these athletes?
I think the thing which never ceases to amaze me with younger golfers is that you can get from one day to the next, you can get a different person, which is just like they go one day and you're like, swinging it unbelievable, hitting it absolutely out the button, and everything's flying. They turn up the next day for exactly the same time, and it looks like they've never picked up the golf club before. And I think the fascinating thing with younger golfers having been around that quite a lot is that to know that everything you say, everything you do, everything they do will have an impact on them because they're so malleable in everything they're doing. You know, they're picking up things, information all the time. They're adapting their movements all the time. So the last thing I want them to do is just like ingrain this one movement. I would rather kind of say, well, let's just go and play some holes and then kind of see what happens after that. And that my philosophy on that, or even if they're in the practice area, you know, create some sort of task for them that is challenging for them, but that's kind of what they want. They want you know, I think I've seen more young golfers be bored just lined up on a driving range hitting golf balls rather than the environment looking like it's chaos, like there's kids going everywhere. And then when you get to the higher level, to realize that they're not as malleable anymore, and you're just looking for such small things that could make, because they're so accomplished and so good at what they do, it might be just a fraction of something. You know, it might be.
So what are we talking about? Are we talking about motor skills? Are we talking about setup? Like, yeah, what type of things are we talking
Yeah,
about?
I mean, it could be setup. It could be. I look at. I would look at more elite athletes now, as in you can give them, depends on where you are, you give them like a real quick fix. Like if they're not hitting the ball flight that they want, that, you know, this needs to happen, this needs to happen. Or on the flip side, to go, okay, we need to look at this area of the game, right, to get you sharp. You have the physical skills to do it, but over time, we need to build up that efficacy. So we need to set some sort of task that they do on a consistent basis for like a longitudinal period of time, so we can then see the ups and downs of that. But as long as they end up 3 months down the line sharper than where they started, then that's really all that matters. So to move something small, you need to, for me, you need to do it over a long period of time to see some sort of lasting result
And
ultimately.
this is going to sound like a really naive question, so I apologize in advance. But would caddies have any involvement in that type of work as well, or not?
Massively. I mean, I think they're with them all the time, you know. So there needs to be communication between the caddies and the coaching staff and whatnot, to, because they, you know, as a coach, you're not there with them all the time at every venture. But if you can get, you know, the caddy to kind of like support this as well, they can encourage this. But I think that's a part of a reminder. I still always want the player to take some ownership over it, so they choose to do it themselves. And if they
Yeah,
don't, then the caddy can remind them.
yeah. I just find it fascinating, almost as a loop, because like you mentioned, coach isn't always there with the player, and but the caddy invariably is, and almost as a feedback loop.
Yeah,
If you're dissecting a round and you're dissecting the shots from a round, and maybe it is on camera so you can watch all your shots, the player might recall certain details or conversations or thoughts with the caddy and go, well, I was aiming for this, doing that. And then you might be having this with the coach in the room, and the caddy can almost drop a bit of information and went, yeah, but you forgot this, or do you not remember being hesitant on that bit and not wanting to do this? And it almost becomes like a little guardian angel sat on your shoulder, of being able to pick up bits of information that might drop out that the player hasn't even thought of, that can just be put into the melting pot to assist the player.
very much so, very much so. And I still have this challenge with, you know, with golf and golf coaching, where I and it goes back to how we view things as well, as like, oh, if they do it in this environment, then the motor will just fire and they'll do it when they get on the golf course. But we know that's not true, right? But we still don't get enough coaches watching their players play in competitive environments and actually seeing, certain shots or certain situations that they're either working on or that might challenge them. There's still not enough of that in my view, especially not at any level, to be quite honest.
Would there ever be a case of I'm assuming not having two people walk around with a player, but where a coach goes and caddies for a player for a day, or let's say for example you've got a player who struggles really bad with third round yips, and the actual skill, talent, or whatever you want to call it is there, but it gets to the back end of a tournament and they're really struggling with it. Can you ever foresee a situation where a coach takes the place of that caddy for the round, almost as a support mechanism for the purely playing the game aspect? I know you're going to have a drop off in terms of understanding yardage and all that type of stuff, but purely from I guess, support of the player for that moment in time.
It does happen, definitely. Not very much, but it definitely does happen in certain events. Player might get their coach to go and caddy for them in that particular event. When I've caddied in some pro-ams. The thing I like, I don't get the benefit of being in there like that. I get the benefit from seeing afar. So I'm kind of like a bit separated, but I'll like position myself within certain areas to be able to watch kind of, what I want to see ultimately. And then you start to kind of go, there's something that we've been working on, this lie into this flag or this type of shot into this flag. And I'll take a specific note on that. But I do think there is a benefit in the certain coaches caddying for players in certain events to see where their kind of heads at and whatnot. I think it would be a benefit to start with if people went and this is the interesting thing is that, I've, like yourself, I've been to watch like tennis players, I've been to football clubs, I've been, speak to people in cricket and, basketball and all different sports. And when I say to them, it's kind of a rarity that a coach will go on the golf course with a player that they're watching, especially at the high level, they're completely like they can't get their head around it. Coaches from other sports.
I think there's an element of that I really like about it in terms of autonomy for the player. I think it's brilliant. I
Yeah,
think it becomes less accountability for the coach and more going, well, no, we're working on all these things in the background. It's down to you to actually try and deliver them. But I think there's also an element during certain tournaments, I would see massive value. So I'm chucking random names of courses out here, but say for example you're at St Andrews and you're working on how you play when the ball is above your feet level because of St Andrews having the natural curvature of the mountains and stuff. If you were to play that as a pro-am event or whatever type of event you were to do, actually your coach being there for 4 rounds of golf for you for an entire weekend would probably give you a lot of time on task in a live moment, which would then give you opportunity to practice it further when they're not there. So I think I wouldn't necessarily say it would need to be all the time, but I'd
yeah,
imagine if I was in that scenario, I would ask coaches to come and support me during particular events or going, you know what, we know we're going to periodize this to work on my
yeah,
high draw. So actually, we're going to play this course that we know is really relevant for that. Can you make yourself available for the 4 days? And you're going to carry on me to help me with that so that over the next 3 tournaments that I've got post that, we've done a block of work in competition.
yeah. I think that's brilliant, to be honest. And I think we have again too much of this tradition, especially at the level where I'm at right now, is that the practice days are kind of Tuesday, Wednesday, right? So the brunt of the coaches will turn up for the practice days, and then when the tournament days, they'll just disappear. Some will stay at certain events like the majors and whatnot. But I think what I've kind of asked people I've been involved with is to go, well, sometimes I'm going to come and watch you for Thursday, Friday. Sometimes I'm going to come and be there for prep Tuesday and Wednesday. And sometimes I'm just going to do a hybrid of that. Sometimes we're going to be, but that's for us to kind of discuss. When I'm there for like viewing, I'm just watching there to see what we've done, to give you some feedback after the round and whatnot. And I'm there for just Tuesday, Wednesday. It's very much about how do we get ready for Thursday. So I don't think it's like a linear process, or it shouldn't be a linear process. It should be something that's very, very specific and task specific. But that means we have to think out, you have to plan it a little bit, and there's a whole different skill set that comes in play there.
No, 100%. As you said, like, I think that level of flexibility is actually a good one because it allows you to figure it out in the moment. As you said, if they're going through a real purple patch, it might
Yeah,
not be you go at all. Go, listen, you're smashing it in a minute. Let's just have a break off.
stay out of my way.
Yeah, you don't need me at this moment in time. Let's just crack on.
Yeah.
And then last question around this: how much do players at the top end work on super strength or work on area development? And are there players that are really comfortable going, you know what, that's an area of my game that I know I'm behind on, but I'm kind of cool with it because I've got all these high areas. The example I always use for this is I think Jonathan Trott, the cricketer, got out LBW like 95% of the time whilst he was at England. And I remember hearing conversations about it, and what he essentially said was, "Yeah, but it's the only way I get out." He said, so whilst I know that I'm going to get out that way, I will get a load of runs in the meantime, knowing that I will get out via that. And I thought it's a really interesting way of doing it rather than almost every ball going, am I going to get caught in the slips? Am I going to get bowled? Is it going to LBW? He went, I will get out getting this way, which causes me certain problems. But in the meantime, look at all the success that I'm having.
Yeah, it's a brilliant question. I've actually just been through this with a player, believe it or not. So it's kind of good timing where um, I feel every player has their superpowers, right? And one of the players that I work with, he noticed in the last year or so, his superpower had really dropped off. So before we kind of revisited what we were doing and we kind of had a good sit down, and I was like, well, look, this is what's happened over the last, year, 18 months. We need to get this superpower back to the level that we know of where you're at. And he was like, yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. We kind of left some other things aside. We dipped out. He's still going to do these other things because he's playing enough and stuff like this. But it wasn't really like a focus of ours. And then we kind of go, right, okay, your superpowers now back up to the level that we know of, when you were like 22 in the world and whatnot. Now we can refine these other areas, right? But we fundamentally have to keep one eye open to this. We don't want to let this drop off again. So we need to monitor it and see where we're at.
And
There's a lot of
are players
yeah.
able to figure out why? Are they able to figure out in that moment why it's dropped off?
Um, I think it would be different. I think some of it would be maybe they hadn't done enough of it. Um, they've been trying to do other things, which trying to make more gains in other areas. So I hadn't given it the attention it needed. I've seen athletes go down these roads of like trying to change things and make things better, just making a wrong decision, of going, I need to change these mechanics. And yeah, it just doesn't work. It kind of makes them worse. And then I've seen others who go, I don't need to touch my mechanics, but actually you do need to get back into, looking at your mechanics because
Mm.
this setup has dropped off, this has dropped off. So we need to pay a little bit of attention to that. I think that players will, a lot of the time, they will know, I think, deep in their core what the reason is. They obviously see the performance outcome of something that's not as sharp. But I guess it would be different for everybody, to be honest, what the cause of that will be.
Yeah, no, it's just a fascinating point because at times I'd imagine it'd be really easy to have an excuse culture of go, well, I wasn't playing as a course that had as much tailwind, which meant I didn't drive it as far. It's like, well, no, actually, that is a bit down to your technique, or you haven't been doing a
Yeah.
lot of driver work, so that is down to you more than anything else.
Yeah, and obviously with statistics that we have, that to me is too much of looking at it on a micro dose, right? Of looking at just one round or one tournament where you need a bigger sample size, to be able, because then all these other things I think neutralize themselves. You're going to have some shots that are into wind, some shots that are downwind, some shots are across, all these kind of things where if you just have one round or one tournament, then certain holes are going to be pretty much in the same direction. So it doesn't give you a big enough a data set.
And then last question before we go on to the book work. How much effect on super strengths or areas development have you seen kind of nerves have? As we mentioned, like with the tournaments you go to and you've seen people around, um, you obviously naturally see it. I think in golf it's more highlighted by the fact that a degree off in one way all of a sudden sends your ball hitting the patrons in the crowd and stuff. So I guess what's the most pronounced example that you've had for someone where you've seen them go, I know you're fully capable of executing this shot, but this is just the moment at this moment in time has just got you caught up in it unnecessarily. Or the other way where you've hit that as well as you could possibly have hit, and you've really stepped up.
I would say I've seen that in both instances at the Ryder Cup Extreme because one player I was with who was literally nearly throwing up going to the first tee, like so nervy and whatnot, and hit birdied the first like both days that he played, or first 2 days that he played. He was able to, even though he was like so nervous and whatnot. And then the other player was the nerves just completely weren't there at the Ryder Cup. He was more nervous in the tournaments building up to it. And when he got there and he stood on that first tee, it was like the pressure just like dropped away completely. Because he's kind of there at that time, like a dream or like um, a childhood goal that he kind of wanted to do. So other things where, um, you know, this might sound strange now, but I've seen superpowers of like, certain putting and driving where they might have dropped off, and there's always this like, oh, you need to think less, or you need to. But actually, with some people, they perform better when you occupy them, and you consume them with something. So all of a sudden, it kind of detaches them a little bit from the magnitude of something. Whereas, like with somebody putting, like they get into a big tournament, if they don't have something to kind of engage them in, it's like their brain just goes wild, and they're
Yeah, that's an amazing point actually, because you can imagine some players love walking down and seeing all the patrons and think, this is good, isn't it? This is mint. Look where I am. Whereas others, they'll probably want to have a chat of going, okay, so after here, we're going out for a meal and then we've got a flight at 7 a.m. And just that conversation piece, almost to make it feel like it's a normal day that they can, they've done a round like this 1,000 times before, is what is needed at that moment in time. I guess a skill of a caddy is
yeah,
understanding
very
what
much
your
so.
player needs at that moment.
Caddies are amazing at that. Like I would say somebody like an Ian Finnis, right, who caddies for Tommy Fleetwood. He's probably the best psychologist that Tommy could have, right? Because he's known him since they were young, and he knows all these little idiosyncrasies, these sort of like, and the two of them together are absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah, it's incredible. Right, I know quickly before time, you mentioned earlier around kind of both the books that you written, etc. So can you give us, I guess, a quick whistle stop tour of what both of them are, but then also what if there's any standout themes that you dragged out from the research that you did for them both?
No, just the one book I've written, The Gifted Junior. I fundamentally, it was a story I wrote because I didn't want to write it as a how-to. And I wanted to write it on certain experiences. And they were kind of like really intensified collective versions of people, in the book that I've experienced. But I wanted somebody to look at it. I fundamentally be like a mirror. You know what I mean? Like somebody's holding up the mirror, and so the people are reading this, going, "This is me in this scenario," and then they kind of like dissect it themselves. I would definitely say writing it was so I had a writing coach because I just didn't have a clue how to do it. Right. So at that time, there's a guy called Matt Rudy who works for Golf Digest. And I remember I wrote it and I had the first chapter and he goes, send me the first chapter. So I did. Then he rewrote it and sent it back to me. And I'm like going, oh my God. Like I said, do you want to write it for, do you want to ghost write it for me? Because it was like, I think he had a literature degree from Michigan or somewhere like that. I mean, it was literally like, oh, I would read that. I wouldn't read this, the one that I wrote. And then he said, well, we could go down that road of me doing that. But how about a better idea is I teach you how to do it. And then you always have that skill. They said, that's going to take a little longer. It's going to be a little bit more difficult. But how about giving that a go? And I was like, do I want to take the easy option of getting him to ghostwriter, or do I want to do the hard option? And I chose the hard option, and I'm ever thankful for it because I see the book now and I go, do you know what? Yeah, I had a coach doing it, but that was me rewriting this and kind of putting it into text and so on and so forth. The next phase for me is then going to be like writing my PhD thesis or my doctoral thesis, because that's a whole different skill in itself. It's a different way of writing. I still don't know how I'm going to do it, but that's why we have supervisors and stuff like this to kind of to help me out with that, to be honest. So yeah. But the thing is, we've done some pilot studies on this already, and it is fascinating some of the themes that come up, in elite golfers kind of practice and how they practice.
Yeah, I think as I said at the start, you've got so much breadth of knowledge and experience that we could go into. I think maybe that's one when you're at a point where you're able to share your findings and share your work. Let's do this again because I
Yeah,
think that
definitely.
it'd be really good from people that I've had on previously that have spoken about their PhD. They've said it's always been really useful to vocalize actually what they found it and how they found it. And then from a listener's perspective, I think it would give a fascinating insight into, practice habits, practice cultures, what bits can we steal? I'd like to be a good thief from all these podcasts and try and implement it into some of my
Well,
work. So
yeah, I
yeah,
mean, the thing for me is like, yes, it's about the practice, but it's also about like the beliefs around where have they come from. So if you choose to do this, why have you chosen that? What are your beliefs around that? Because beliefs drive behaviors, right? So every day somebody goes and practices, beliefs are like a shortcut or a mindset to go, oh, I'm just going to go and do this. But actually, are they really thinking about what they need to do, or are they just like going on autopilot?
yeah, because it's habitual without any
Yeah,
real
it's
strategy or
exactly.
plan.
And we looked. Well, I've looked into some of the stress research from a lady called Ali Crum at Stanford, and this metacognitive mindset around belief. So so you don't create too much dissonance, right? Well, I mean, there's always going to be a bit if you're challenging beliefs, but it's ultimately going, okay, well, you chose to do it this way, no problem. There's a little bit of evidence to suggest that that's okay. But have you ever heard of this stuff? Right. So you almost show them something different.
Yeah.
And then you ultimately say, well, now when you go and practice, there's a choice you have. So the choice is just keep doing what you've been doing, and there's a risk to that, or choose something different, but there's also a risk to that as well.
And the you know the informity behind it is only ever going to help, because there might be different moments that you flip between two practice types and go, actually at this moment I need that, the way I used to work. At this moment now I'm in an exploration phase. I want to go down this newer role and be comfortable that, if results start peaking and troughing, that's okay, because you've got more tools to your belt to hopefully be able
Yeah.
to flatten that out and develop your game or develop your practice style.
Like in golf, people get they get attached to words, I think, more than anything, and it's like, this blocked and random sort of continuum. And I'm just going to people, but that's just like scheduling of practice trials, it like, what does it really do? There's no intervention within that and whatnot. And actually golf isn't played in a random order, it's played in a serial order. So do we ever need to go into this like completely random, chaotic world? How about there's other stuff? And then they go, oh, I haven't heard of that before. And then you maybe do a little bit of education and go, okay, well, now you've got a different tool to be able to go and challenge your practice. Or every day you go, what am I going to do today to get me closer to my goal? Oh, I'm going to choose this. It makes me feel a bit more uncomfortable, but I feel like I need this today.
Rather than I turn up and practice and hope it gets me a little bit better.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Right. Last question for me, which is, if I was to speak to the players you work with, or the colleagues that you work alongside, how would you hope they described you in 3 words, and why?
3 words. Intense, fair, driven.
Okay, that's interesting. Because I'd imagine the only reason I say that is because I could imagine the intense and fair at times could be counter thing of what they seem as fair, with you being intense trying to get results or trying to drive them to be better. They might be like, he's not acting fair, but it's interesting that, yeah, those two distinctions are there.
I think I'm generally fair in or I would hope I'm fair, and I do try and do this, is that when things are good, I'm very vocal about things are good, but when things drop off, I'm very vocal about that as well. So it's it's not all one way, it's like there's a very kind of a fairness of what I would see, from the athlete, to be honest.
No, brilliant. Well, let's do it.
Maybe
As
maybe
I said,
I'll ask them and see what
ask
comes
them,
of it.
yeah, let me know what they come back. Go, how would you describe me in 3 words? But yeah, yeah, as I said at the start, we were never going to be able to do everything you've been through. So definitely after your PhD is done, we'll jump on again and go through some other bits. But in the
I
meantime,
did I
thank.
did I did have one player recently turn around and go about like, you're so direct, right, and like blunt, and I was like, yeah, I can tend to be like that, and I said, but you know, do I need to kind of adapt this a little bit? And the lady went to me and goes, no, I mean, you cut through so much bullshit. It's brilliant.
Yeah. And that's what we said about that bit earlier. Personality types is important, right? Like some people will love that. They'll go, no, you just give me the detail I need, and then it's my job. I'm a big person. I can get on with it. Or other people will be like, okay, maybe you're not the coach for me because I need a little
That's
bit more
right.
fluffy.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
I like the
exactly.
idea, I actually agree with, but I also don't want to jump off the bridge on the way home. So if you could, maybe I need a bit more fluffy, but that's why
I
I
think
think,
that's where the intensity comes in at times as well. Like, and intensity and driven, I guess they come together because I just want the best the players I work with. That's really what it comes down to.
and I'm a big believer, I think, in sports moving forward. I think the coaches being hired or collection of coaches being hired that are able to fill the psychological needs of players is going to become far more prominent. I think at the moment we go a lot down tactical, in possession, out
Yeah,
of possession, particularly in team sports. But I actually think if you have a situation where you know that the majority of your group are whatever personality types, you will begin to cater a staff that are able to get the best out of them. So in some occasions that will be direct and intense, and other occasions that will be more fluffy. It doesn't mean that either environment's going to be wrong. It just means that as a hiring organization, you know what you have, you know what helps what you have, and you know maybe a little bit what you need. So I think that's
I
something that in
I
the future will happen.
I have two coaches that work for me or with me at Swiss Golf, and that's exactly why the one person that I hired, right? So one person left who was a coach, kind of worked with me for the men's side, and I'm in there as a certain personality to cut through all the BS, get straight to the point of what we want to do, have some uncomfortable conversations, which I don't like, but that's just needed sometimes. But I have two coaches that work kind of with me. They're more of that kind of that personality type, a bit softer, a bit more kind of fluffy in that respect, and that's why we have them. I don't want another one of me, you know.
Yeah, and I think that, yeah, particularly in team sports, I think it's become increasingly prominent. I think that we're only beginning to scratch the surface on it because I think it gets the best out of. You look at like Pogba and Mourinho, looks like a match like made in hell. But actually, if you had someone who potentially could have brokered that situation and be like, Jose, listen, these group of 5 or 6 players, let me get them on side and I can deliver messages and they're going to respond better to like that. I think you have the manager at the top. You're going to have all these people underneath that are able to coordinate with the players that fit into this style. And then at times that directness, when it does need to come, is okay because we've got enough. The analogies up again. We've got enough poker chips in hand, so we've done all the relationship building via these people. So that then, if I need to spend a few chips giving you a bit of a rocket or being direct, it's okay because we've got a lot of money in the bank. What you don't
Yeah,
want is trying to do that when it's yeah. Once you're basically all in, you don't want to be trying to chuck more money at it and losing your car.
I remember watching some of those documentaries like Man City, and obviously you don't get the full picture, but you kind of when I'm watching them, I'm not watching Pep or whatnot. I'm watching the faces on the players that he's kind of addressing. The same with like Arteta in that All or Nothing, and you see players like a Rodri at Man City who's like completely like engrossed in like what Guardiola's saying and the intensity of it and whatnot. And then you see like someone like Kevin De Bruyne who's literally just like sat back, like completely chilled, almost like he's complete not even listening.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? The disparity between the group, it is incredible.
And
It
like De
is
Bruyne's
amazing.
like just there, like he's the last one to put his boots on and his like socks. He's not he seems like he's so comfortable just like being who he is, and he knows how to play football, doesn't he?
Yeah,
He doesn't need a pep talk like that.
yeah. He's like, I want to be the best. I don't need all this rev me up type stuff. Just let me go on the
Yeah,
pitch and we'll win. Job done.
yeah, yeah,
Whereas other people, they
exactly.
need that revving up, and yeah, it's
And
it's a
I
fascinating
think like
piece.
Haaland as well. I don't think Haaland needs that revving up. I think he's just like you'd be bet you'd probably get more out of Haaland than De Bruyne having a one-on-one with them, just having a chat and just seeing like how they are and you know they're kind of like stressed out about anything or whatnot. Where some need just like lifting like all the time.
Yeah, it's an incredible, as you said, I'd love to be able to do that full time for a season just to see the different things, but those are brilliant little insights into the way people work. But yeah, Stuart, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure, and as I said, once the PhD is done, maybe we'll go for a round two and revisit what
Absolutely.
your learners from there.
Sounds good.
Thanks for listening to the Sports Initiative podcast with me, Michael Wright. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at the Sports Initiative Podcast, and share this podcast with friends and family. I'll see you next week.